Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd like to start out with just a little reading, and then I'll talk about how I came to write this book and the whole process of being in bed with Morrison, as I was for 5 years, a bit longer than quite a few women who he knew. Morrison's library, this is a little bit into the story. It's not the beginning. Morrison's library was narrow and high-ceilinged, a place of repose, order, and scholarship. On the shelves, in addition to 20,000 books in more than 20 languages, lay at least 400 early manuscript dictionaries and grammars, 4,000 pamphlets, and 2,000 maps and engravings, each one meticulously catalogued. Of all his collections, which included bibelots, silks, and jade, Morrison cherished none as much as his books. He loved the written word for the way it secured thoughts and experiences, lending them structure, preventing them from passing out of sight and memory. Morrison's greatest regret was that for all his accomplishments, he was not, he knew, a great writer. He had published a book and a good many reports and telegrams, but when he thought of poets and writers he admired, he felt humble, and not many things humbled Morrison. For great authors, like Kipling, his favorite, gave moral sense to the world. It was not just facility with language or even a rich imagination, he knew, that made an author great, but the way the writer reached for and honored the truth. Morrison freely confessed to the limitations of his own craft. Deep inside, he knew that a worse problem was that in his public writing, at least, he was incapable of an unwavering allegiance to the truth. He could not deny to himself that how he understood the world did not always accord with the way he presented it to others. There was the odd doubt about an ally, which he thought unwise to voice, for example, information that for whatever reason he did not wish to share, strategic considerations, even, on occasion, necessary flattery. Morrison confided only to his journal, Let's No. 41 Indian and Colonial Rough Diary, giving an entire page to a day. That was actually the title of the diary. A serious, manly notebook, bound in leather and bearing advertisements for Remington typewriters and Whitfield's safe and steel doors on its inside covers. Its pages faintly lined for convenience. Morrison had his eye on posterity, and to posterity he would be true. At the same time, he would be loyal to the place that for all his travels he kept close to his heart, Australia. His journals would return there in the end, even if he did not. It was to his journal and those who lived under the big, forgiving Australian sky that he would confide his most awkward truths, the latest being that he was wildly infatuated with Miss May Ruth Perkins, his Maisie, Maisie, Maisie. But he would not dawdle now over sentimental matters. The unopened sack of mail on the work table reproached him. Morrison touched the precious handkerchief to his lips. She gave it to him, before folding and replacing it in his pocket. Tipping the sack onto the table, he chose an envelope at random and sliced into it with his scrimshaw letter opener. It was from J.O.P. Blunt, the Times correspondent in Shanghai. What news from the city of dreadful dust, it began. Morrison could almost smell Blunt's lavender pomade. Next was a note from some busybody in the church, harping on that Morrison had still not reported on a modern college that missionaries had established somewhere or another. Morrison wrote himself a reminder to look into it. His old neighbor, Prince Su, meanwhile, had sent a note addressed to "My dear younger brother." Morrison knew enough of Chinese ways to perceive both the endearment and the condescension in the address. There was a letter from Bangkok. "I hope you are happy," wrote his friend Eliza R. Skidmore of the National Geographic Society. "At last you have your war." As he sorted through the post, putting some letters on his desk to answer straight away and setting some others aside, he stopped to dash off a line to Moberly Bell, his editor, pointedly noting to his editor how good it had been to get out and see things for himself, and remarking, by the by, that his health had improved greatly since the outbreak of war. Much to do, he pulled up on his sleeve guards and, seated at his desk, set up his blotter and ink pot. Dear May, dearest May, Maisie, May dear, dearest. As I said, I've been in bed with Morrison for 5 years. That's the time that I've spent researching and writing A Most Immoral Woman, which centers on an affair that Morrison had with a sexually adventurous young American in 1904. The actual affair lasted a mere, if action-packed, 4 months. I say in bed with Morrison not only because of the novel's sexually charged narrative, but also because of the intimate relationship that a novelist necessarily enjoys with her characters. It's not just a matter of sharing your characters' adventures and thinking their thoughts, speaking their words, or dreaming their dreams. We often act as novelists as if we can do with our characters as we please. We can tickle them and torment them, even tie them down on the railway tracks if it amuses us. In my previous 5 novels, I've sent characters into the fruit aisles of the supermarket to do unspeakable things with fruit. I've dispatched them variously to China, Byron Bay, and prison. I've had them abducted by aliens, rescued by ferals, confused by art, tied up in boardrooms, literally, and locked up in immigration detention. And a character you create can surprise you. They can rebel against you. They can refuse to be pushed and pull you along instead. And that's when, as a novelist, you really know that it's working. But while A Most Immoral Woman is assuredly a novel in that I've freely invented dramatic incidents, conversations, and, as you've seen, internal monologues, as you all know, George Ernest Morrison is hardly my creation. There'd be no tying him down to railway tracks, unless, of course, I'm speaking metaphorically, he tied himself down there first. Many of you will be very familiar with this complex person, Chinese Morrison. But I thought maybe there might be people who didn't know the general outline of his life. If you don't know the general outline of Morrison's life, would you put your hand up and I'll see whether... Okay, great. I'll give you a little short course. George Ernest Morrison was born in 1862 in Geelong, in what was then the colony of Victoria. Before he was 22, he had trekked solo from Melbourne to Adelaide, paddled the Murray alone in a canoe, sailed on a blackbirding ship to the Pacific Islands to report on the practice of blackbirding or abducting islanders for work in the plantations, the sugar plantations of Queensland, reporting on that for The Age. And again on his own, he had retraced Burke and Will's footsteps, only 20 years after their own ill-fated expedition. He had less luck trying to walk across New Guinea. He was speared and nearly died from his wounds. Morrison got a medical degree basically to make his parents happy. It's an old story, isn't it? But he considered journalism a more noble profession. He made a name for himself very early on by publishing accounts of his adventures in The Age and so on. It was the book he wrote about his epic overland journey from Shanghai to Burma in 1894, which Richard was just talking about, An Australian in China. And it was this book which led to the offer from Moberly Bell, who was editor of the Times of London, to him to become the Times' full-time China correspondent. He became the very, very first full-time foreign correspondent in China in 1897, when he went to take up this post. 3 years later, he was caught up in the 1900 siege of the legations by the murderously xenophobic Boxer rebels and their allies in the Qing court. He was in the siege. He actually fought the Boxers. He was nearly killed. He was shot in the arse. He wrote what was at the time considered the definitive account of the siege. So he became very famous. It was said that at the time there were the 2 most famous Australians in the world were George Morrison and Nellie Melba. And he had certain opinions about Nellie Melba. She was a very immoral woman. She allowed conversation at her table that no proper woman would allow. I'd like to meet her. 12 years after the Boxer Rebellion, not long after the Republican Revolution, which overthrew the Qing dynasty, Morrison became an advisor to President Yuan Shikai, and he died in 1920. Only 8 years before that, he died at the age of 58. He married for the first time at the age of 50 a woman who was in her early 20s, his secretary, Jenny Walk Robin, and they had 3 children, one of whom, Alistair, is still alive. It was an extraordinary life, full of incident. I knew that if I was going to write an historical fiction based on one of these incidents, and I really did want to write about this incident after, in fact, reading about it in The Man Who Died Twice, which I had to review for Morrison's old paper, The Age. That affair he had with May just caught my imagination. I wanted to do it. And I knew I had to get to know him intimately. It was daunting to realize how much research could be done on the subject of Morrison alone. And I actually had Cyril Pearl's biography. I had read it before. I returned to it. But I discovered that these two are 2 of 3 major biographies. He has a substantial presence in the biographies of many of his contemporaries, including the fascinating Edmund Backhouse, Hermit of Peking, even the Empress Dowager Cixi. If you read biographies of her, he comes into the story. He was a really big personality. All the memoirs of the Boxer Rebellion, all the histories of the Boxer Rebellion will talk about Morrison, and obviously anything about Yuan Shikai will also talk about him. His life and times are exceedingly well documented, and not least of all by himself. And I want to say here that I owe a huge debt of gratitude towards the ANU for making me a visiting fellow and allowing me access to the wonderful collections that are held in the Menzies and other libraries, and also, very crucially, to transcripts of Morrison's diaries. The diaries are all in the Mitchell Library of the State Library of New South Wales, and you can look at them on microfiche. They are so difficult to read. He has this incredibly difficult handwriting, and it's actually Professor Lo Hui Min, Helen Lowe, and others who spent, a decades transcribing letters and diaries. And I had access to these diaries, and it was that allowed this book to be written, really. I mean, I must say it was wonderful to be able to look at the diary for all of 1904 typed up, transcribed. It was fantastic. Now, by contrast, May Ruth Perkins, the woman he met and became incredibly infatuated with one night. Oh, now here's another story. He actually met her on December 17th, 1903. He met her at a luncheon, and was instantly taken with her. He described her as a gem full of life and happiness with 10 million gold dollars behind her. He never failed to note those sort of details. But at the same time, he didn't really see her again. And as he said, she passed out of his memory. He encounters her again on the last day of February 1904 at Shanhai Guan, Mountain Sea Pass, where the Great Wall ends in the east and meets the sea. And that's where the affair begins. For purposes of the novel, after trying to work in massive flashback passages, I just went, no, he didn't meet her in December. It just doesn't make any sense narratively. Let's start with the end of February. Anyway, who is this woman who he met, who he had a wild affair with, became completely infatuated with, and was thrown into agonies of jealousy as a result of the fact that she didn't just have an affair with him, she had an affair with nearly all of China. She would have disappeared from history entirely had Morrison not recorded their affair and what she told him about herself, if he had not recorded this in his diaries. And there's many women he had affairs with who have disappeared from history. Why has she not disappeared? I would say the main reason is that Cyril Pearl obviously found her fascinating. he was riveted by what Morrison had to say. Now, he summarized them in Morrison of Peking, his biography, and I'm quoting Pearl, quoting the diaries in this part here, and not the diaries themselves, because interestingly, there are some pages missing in his journal during this year, and not all of these quotations can be found in what we have of the diaries. But here we go. Here are some of the revelations. These are Cyril Pearl quoting Morrison, talking about May. Accustomed, as long as she can remember, to play with herself, every morning, even when unwell, even after passing the night in bed with a man. Seduced by Dr. Jack Fee, a doctor, in the French restaurant in San Francisco known as the Hens and Chickens or Poultry or some such. Pregnant. Went to Washington. Got out of difficulty after abortion. Slept constantly with Congressman Gaines. 4 miscarriages. Kissed all the way over in the Siberia after leaving Honolulu by Captain Tremaine Smith. Had for days in succession by Martin Egan. Mrs. Goodnow had told her that once she was kissed by a woman, she would never wish to be kissed by a man. Her desire now is to get a Japanese maid to accompany her back to America and to kiss her every morning. In Tianjin, she was kissed by Zeppelin, the Dutch consul. In Shanghai, she wired me, "Please come, Japan, be good." That same evening, she met C.R. Holcomb, who had her 4 times in 2 hours. It's just a little sample. One evening, and Morrison writes about this in his journal, she showed him a great collection of love letters from different men, any one of which, he noted dryly, would have been sufficient to convict her of a lack of chastity. He described her as one of the most immoral women he'd ever met. Morrison also, as I said, has noted that her father had $10 million gold dollars, was a millionaire, and a senator. So it didn't take too much effort, thanks to online genealogy, to establish that her father was George Clement Perkins, a Republican senator from California, a former Californian governor, and a shipping magnate with commercial interests in mining and other areas as well. The U.S. congressional website, which noted that his congressional archives are with the U.S. Congress, had a link for his family papers to the California State Historical Society's Baker Library in Oakland, California. I contacted the library, and they provided me with an index to the papers and a list of local researchers with their contact details. So I engaged one of these, Maida Counts, to go through the papers looking for anything related to May. Maida, who was fantastic because she really understood and loved the story and was fascinated, she uncovered a treasure trove. There were clippings from the social pages of the Oakland newspapers, which featured fantastically detailed descriptions of her frocks, descriptions of the horse-drawn carriage she once decorated with hundreds of yellow roses in order to parade about with a girlfriend of hers. It had a description of a Valentine's Day party for which she'd lavishly decorated the whole house, including hanging loving bows of red satin on the windows and making little door screens of satin hearts and piling the chandeliers with fango grass and other things. The social reports were absolutely breathless in their admiration. Less impressed with her were milliners and others who had to constantly forward her bills for her hats and her gloves and so on to her parents. And they made it quite clear that she was rather nonchalant about paying for her extravagances. The headmistress of Mills College for Women made it eminently clear in her letters to May's parents that while everyone at the school adored May and considered her to have much potential, her boy craziness was a bit of a problem, as was her tendency to escape boarding school and homework on weekends to return to Oakland to party. I mean, this is great stuff, and nobody had ever looked at it before. Her exasperated father wrote letters to May reminding her that less fortunate girls had to labor for the privilege of an education. He chided her for her terrible penmanship, for her terrible habits of correspondence, and she did put her parents through quite a lot of grief. Some of it was a little bit obscure. Her father was quite exercised by the fact that at one point she cut her hair into a fringe, into bangs. This detail mystified me until I did some research and discovered that bangs were a hairstyle worn by working-class immigrant women to cover chicken pox and other scars on their foreheads. And because working class girls, especially immigrant ones, were assumed to hold lax views on sexual morality, bangs as a style signified hussy. So this was all fantastic material. The most exciting find of all, however, in this Perkins Family Archive was this big fat pile of love letters addressed to May from a staggering number of men, and covering a period of years up to 1902, when she would have been 24.